The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls, a mournful sound that matched the emptiness in John's heart.
He sat in the old wooden chair by the dying fire, cradling his 3-month-old daughter against his chest. Her tiny fists clutched at his worn denim shirt as she whimpered, hungry and restless. The baby's cries had grown weaker over the past few days, and that terrified him more than anything else. He had tried everything he could think of, but nothing seemed to work. The formula he had managed to buy from town was running dangerously low, and he had no idea how he would make it through the next week, let alone the harsh winter months that stretched ahead. It had been 6 weeks since Sarah died. 6 weeks since he had held her hand as she took her last breath, her face pale and peaceful despite the pain she had endured. Childbirth complications, the doctor had said, though those words did little to ease the crushing weight of grief that had settled over John like a heavy blanket. Sarah had been his everything, his partner in building this life on the frontier, his companion through countless hardships and small joys. They had dreamed together of raising a family in this cabin they had built with their own hands, of watching their children grow strong and happy under the vast Montana sky.
Now those dreams lay shattered, scattered like ashes in the wind.
The baby stirred in his arms, her mouth searching instinctively for nourishment that he couldn't provide. John felt the familiar sting of tears behind his eyes, but he blinked them away. He had cried enough these past weeks, and tears wouldn't fill his daughter's belly or bring her mother back. He had named her Rose, after Sarah's favorite flower, the delicate pink blooms that grew wild near the creek each spring. Sarah had been so excited when she learned she was pregnant, already planning the nursery and sewing tiny clothes by lamplight. She never got the chance to hold their daughter, slipping away just hours after the birth, her body too weak to fight any longer. John looked down at Rose's small face, so like her mother's with those same delicate features and wisps of light brown hair. She deserved so much better than this, better than a grieving father who barely knew how to care for himself, let alone a helpless infant. He had grown up on a ranch, learning how to rope cattle and break horses, how to survive in the wilderness and shoot straight. But nobody had taught him how to soothe a crying baby or how to keep going when the person you loved most in the world was gone forever. The neighboring ranches were miles away, and most folks were struggling with their own hardships as winter approached. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, but now that independence felt more like isolation. The cabin grew colder as night fell, and John carefully laid Rose in the wooden cradle he had built during Sarah's pregnancy. He had sanded it smooth and carved small flowers into the headboard, working late into the evenings while Sarah watched and smiled. Now it stood as another reminder of happier times, of a future that would never come to pass. He added another log to the fire and tried to warm some of the remaining formula, measuring it out carefully to make it last. Rose drank eagerly, her tiny hands grasping at the bottle, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. She needed more than he could give her, and the realization made him feel like a failure as a father. The knock at the door came so suddenly that John nearly dropped the bottle. He froze, listening, wondering if he had imagined it. Out here, visitors were rare, especially after dark. The knock came again, firmer this time, accompanied by a woman's voice calling out against the wind. John carefully placed Rose back in her cradle and crossed to the door, his hand instinctively going to the rifle that hung above the frame. You could never be too careful on the frontier, where desperate men sometimes did desperate things. He opened the door a crack and found himself looking at Martha Henderson, the wife of the rancher whose land bordered his own to the east. Martha stood on his porch, bundled against the cold in a heavy wool coat and knitted shawl. In her arms, she carried a large woven basket covered with a checkered cloth. Her face was weathered from years of frontier life, but her eyes were kind as they met his. Behind her, the last light of day painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. John stared at her, too surprised to speak. The Hendersons kept to themselves mostly, and while they had always been neighborly, they weren't close friends. He and Martha had exchanged perhaps a dozen words in the 3 years since he and Sarah had settled here. Martha didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past him gently, bringing with her the smell of fresh bread and something savory that made John's stomach clench with sudden hunger. He hadn't realized how little he had been eating, too focused on caring for Rose and managing his grief to think about his own needs. Martha set the basket on the table and turned to face him, her expression a mixture of sympathy and determination. She told him that she had heard about Sarah from the doctor who had passed through their ranch on his way back to town. She explained that she had wanted to come sooner but had been laid up with a bad cold herself. Now that she was better, she had come as quickly as she could. John didn't know what to say. He stood there awkwardly, his cowboy hat still on his head, feeling like a child caught in some mistake. Martha began unpacking the basket, her movements brisk and efficient. There were jars of preserved vegetables, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, a pot of stew wrapped in towels to keep it hot, fresh eggs carefully cushioned in straw, and a tin of cookies. But what made John's breath catch was what she pulled out last: several bottles of milk and more formula for the baby, along with clean cloths and even some tiny clothes that must have belonged to one of her own children years ago. Martha told him that she understood what he was going through, at least in part. She had lost her first child many years ago, a son who had lived only 3 days. The pain never truly left, she said, but it became something you could carry, something that didn't crush you with every breath. She looked over at Rose in her cradle and her face softened. The baby had quieted somewhat, lulled by the warmth of the fire and her small meal. Martha walked over and gently picked her up, cradling her with the practiced ease of someone who had raised 5 children of their own. She examined Rose with a critical eye, noting her thin frame and the slight rash on her skin. What followed was a lesson in infant care that John desperately needed. Martha showed him how to properly hold the baby, how to support her head and keep her warm. She demonstrated the right way to prepare the formula, explaining that he had been making it too thin, not giving Rose enough nutrition. She pointed out that the baby needed to be bathed regularly, even in winter, to prevent infections and rashes. She checked the cabin with an experienced eye, suggesting small changes to make it safer and more comfortable for an infant. She even offered to send one of her daughters over twice a week to help with the housework and the baby, at least until John found his footing. John felt something break open inside him, some dam that had been holding back not just grief but fear and desperation and bone-deep exhaustion. He found himself sitting down heavily at the table, his hat finally coming off, his hands shaking slightly as Martha pressed a bowl of hot stew into them and told him to eat. She didn't make him talk about his feelings or offer platitudes about God's plan or how Sarah was in a better place. Instead, she simply moved around his cabin with quiet efficiency, putting things in order, warming more milk for Rose, and treating him not with pity but with the practical kindness of someone who understood that sometimes survival was the only goal you could manage. As John ate, Martha talked about everyday things, about her own family and the challenges of the coming winter, about the new foal that had been born at their ranch and the trouble they were having with coyotes. Her voice was soothing in its normalcy, a reminder that life continued even in the face of tragedy. She mentioned that her husband Bill had extra work if John needed it, mending fences and helping with the livestock, something to bring in a bit of money to help with expenses. She didn't make it sound like charity, just neighborly cooperation, the way things were done out here where people had to rely on each other to survive. When Rose started crying again, Martha heated one of the bottles she had brought and showed John exactly how much the baby should be eating and how often. She explained the signs of a healthy baby versus one who was struggling, teaching him to watch for certain cues and behaviors. She promised to check back in a few days and to bring more supplies. She also mentioned that there was a young widow in town, Rebecca, whose own baby was just a few months older than Rose. Rebecca had more milk than her baby needed and had offered to help wet nurse if John wanted, or at least to provide advice and support from someone going through the same stages of infant care. The evening passed in a blur of new information and small comforts. Martha stayed until she was satisfied that John had eaten a proper meal and that Rose was settled and comfortable. Before she left, she clasped his hand firmly and told him something he would never forget. She said that Sarah would want him to survive this, would want him to be strong for their daughter. She told him that grief was natural and necessary, but that Rose needed him to be present, to be her father and not just a ghost living in the past. She said it with such certainty, such unwavering conviction, that John found himself nodding, found himself believing that maybe, just maybe, he could do this. After Martha left, John sat for a long time in the quiet cabin, listening to the fire crackle and Rose's soft breathing from the cradle. The basket of food sat on the table like a small miracle, evidence that he wasn't as alone as he had thought. He realized that he had been so consumed by grief and fear that he had forgotten one of the fundamental truths of frontier life, that communities survived by helping each other, by showing up when times were hard, by sharing what they had even when they didn't have much. Martha's knock at his door had been more than just a delivery of food. It had been a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, a reminder that he didn't have to face this impossible situation entirely on his own. In the days that followed, John found himself slowly emerging from the fog of grief that had enveloped him. Martha returned as promised, bringing more supplies and her daughter Emma, a capable 15-year-old who proved invaluable in helping care for Rose. Rebecca from town did indeed come to visit, bringing her own baby and offering both practical advice and genuine friendship. John took Bill Henderson up on his offer of work, finding that the physical labor helped clear his mind and gave him a sense of purpose beyond just surviving day to day. Slowly, painfully, he began to build a new life, one that honored Sarah's memory while still moving forward. Rose began to thrive under this expanded circle of care. Her cheeks filled out, her cries grew stronger and more demanding, and she started to reach for things and smile. John learned to interpret her different cries, to know when she was hungry versus tired versus just wanting to be held. He found that talking to her about her mother helped both of them, telling her stories about Sarah and all the love that had gone into preparing for her arrival. He showed her the flowers carved on her cradle and promised that when spring came, they would plant roses by the cabin door in her mother's memory. The basket that Martha had brought that cold winter evening became a symbol of hope for John. He kept it even after the food was gone, using it to store Rose's things, a tangible reminder of the moment when everything began to change. He learned that accepting help wasn't weakness but wisdom, that community was what made survival possible in the harsh frontier lands. He discovered reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed, the kind that came from having someone depend on you completely, from knowing that giving up was not an option because a tiny life hung in the balance. Years later, when Rose was old enough to understand, John would tell her the story of that terrible time after her mother died. He would describe how lost and hopeless he had felt, how he had wondered if he could possibly raise a daughter on his own. And then he would tell her about the knock at the door, about Martha Henderson appearing like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to pray, bringing not just food but hope and connection, and the reminder that no one has to face their darkest moments alone. He would explain that her mother's love hadn't died with her, that it lived on in every person who had stepped up to help care for them, in every act of kindness that had carried them through those brutal first months. The story became part of their family history, a testament to the power of community and human kindness. Rose grew up knowing that she was loved not just by her father but by an entire network of people who had helped ensure her survival. She learned the importance of helping others in their time of need, of showing up with a basket of food or a helping hand when someone was struggling. The values that had saved her and her father became the values she carried forward into her own life, creating ripples of kindness that extended far beyond that one cold winter evening when a knock at the door changed everything.